The 1850s had been golden years for Napoleon III and the Second Empire. Industry had been developed and national prosperity revived. Most importantly, Napoleon III had restored a sense of order to the country, temporarily ending years of sharp factional division. Yet by the 1860s, this period of repose was beginning to diminish. A series of ill-advised free trade agreements with Great Britain had had an adverse effect on the French economy. As cheaply priced British goods flooded French markets, French business owners were forced to cut wages and jobs. As unemployment grew, workers began to turn against the government. Since labor unions were illegal in France, labor activists were forced to organize in secret, some assuming a hostile and radical tone. With the economic downturn of the 1860s, socialists began to encourage labor resistance. Mass strikes, technically illegal under the current laws, were being staged by the end of the decade. Republicans had always been cold to Napoleon III's Second Empire. Although driven underground during the 1850s, they had never been extinguished. And during the 1860s, a group of Republican lawyers, journalists, and professionals were coming to imagine a Republican renaissance as they began organizing once again and building a new political coalition. By the mid-1860s, a faction of so-called young Republicans managed to win seats in the Corps Legislatif. They allied with liberals who were becoming increasingly skeptical of the Napoleonic government's commercial policies and its authoritarianism. Taken together, it was evident a new opposition movement was taking shape among French political elites, one that was warming to the idea of liberal reform, if not replacing the imperial system with a quasi-republican form of government. Napoleon III was perceptive enough to realize he needed the support of political elites. Suppression was not an option, and so instead he opted for a policy of concessions. In 1867, he dropped his conservative Prime Minister, Eugène Rouet, and appointed the moderate Republican, Émile Ollivier, in his place. Working in conjunction with the government, Napoleon believed that Ollivier would assist in pushing through needed political reforms that would pacify the opposition. However, putting through these reforms would take time, and in the late 1860s, this was not something that Napoleon III had a great deal of. As political opposition mounted at home, Napoleon III was confronted with a new challenge that would have implications for the future. And this challenge was not coming from within France. It was coming from across the Rhine, where political developments in Germany were rapidly seizing the attention of Europe. If the 1860s were tension-ridden for France, in Germany, they had witnessed a series of political triumphs. During the decade, the conservative Prussian minister, Otto von Bismarck, had managed to tame the liberal opposition in the country and expand Prussian influence across central and western Germany. In 1866, he had dealt a demoralizing military defeat to the Austrian Habsburgs, fulfilling long-standing aspirations for a united German state. The North German Confederation, created in 1867, signaled the growing strength of Prussia, threatening to create a new superpower on the European continent. Bismarck had aspirations of bringing the remaining German states in the south under Prussian control and completing the process of German unification. Yet he knew that to do this would risk a potential war with France, since the French government would not, and could not, tolerate a strong Germany directly on its eastern border. To this end, Bismarck used his diplomatic cunning to goad France into a military conflict, one he believed they could not win. In 1870, following a series of foreign policy embarrassments and missteps, Bismarck got his wish. That summer, as tensions mounted, Napoleon III precipitously declared war on Prussia. Turning to his top generals, Napoleon III asked candidly whether the French army was prepared to take on the Prussian military. "The army is prepared down to the last button of our uniforms," the Marshal Edmond Leboeuf replied confidently. This confidence, however, proved illusory. A rapid succession of Prussian victories revealed the ill-prepared state of the French military. By early September, Prussian forces had managed to sweep through eastern France and were on the verge of taking Paris. With the war effort going disastrously, Republican opponents believed the time had come to rid themselves of the detested Bonapartist regime for good. Taking the lead, the Republican leader, Léon Gambetta, wasted no time in storming to the Hôtel de Ville in Paris and declaring an end to the Second Empire. A new republic and a government of national defense was set up, with Gambetta and the Republicans preaching war to the end against Prussia in the defense of the French nation. Yet this declaration was more Republican illusion than reality. The war effort continued to disintegrate, and by late November, Paris was surrounded and cut off from supplies. Within a month, starving Parisians were raiding the city zoo, leaving no animal untouched in their search for food. Given this deplorable situation, by January, France was compelled to sue for peace. For his part, Bismarck intended to impose a crippling peace treaty on the new Republican regime. French Republicans were forced to agree to a military occupation of the country. A 5 billion franc war indemnity was also imposed on the government. The most harrowing aspect of this treaty, however, was its territorial losses. France was forced to cede the eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany, effectively leaving the nation amputated. While the crippling indemnity and loss of territory was humiliating enough, Bismarck added further insult to injury. On January 18th, he summoned the Prussian king to Versailles, and there, amongst an assembly of Prussian military commanders and officials, King Wilhelm of Prussia was crowned Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. In the very same room that had served as the seat of French power and prestige since the days of Louis XIV, the creation of a new German Reich was declared, finalizing France's humiliating defeat for all of Europe to see. Defeat in the Franco-Prussian War left a pall over the new Third Republic. A humiliating peace treaty and sense of defeatism hardly marked the fresh start desired by Republican elites after years of Bonapartist rule. As well, politicians now had to confront the reality of a strong and aggressive German empire directly on France's eastern border, an existential and geopolitical threat that would loom over the nation for the next 75 years, generating concerns over how to respond to the so-called German question. Another ominous sign for the new republic was the fact that the National Assembly, elected after the war, was dominated by conservatives, and primarily royalists at that. These royalists cared nothing for the republic. They thinly concealed their desires to restore royal rule in France, but many politicians were not fooled. While Republicans agonized over a potential royal restoration on the immediate horizon, the royalist threat was by no means a foregone conclusion. Royalists were divided on which dynasty to place on the throne. Ultra-royalists preferred the Duc de Chambord, the grandson of Charles X and the last existing member of the Bourbon line. Liberal monarchists favoring the Orleanist line, however, looked to Louis Philippe's grandson, the Count of Paris. These divisions weakened the royalist faction in the assembly, giving Republicans hope that the Republic might endure over reactionary aspirations. Heading the new government was Adolphe Thiers, an old liberal sympathetic to the House of Orleans. This too was a bad sign, since it was known that Thiers himself was not necessarily warm to the idea of a republican government and favored liberal monarchy. Confronted with a potential monarchist majority in the National Assembly, moderates and radicals feared that it would attempt to undermine the republic won in 1870. Paris was especially on edge as the new government set to work. The French capital had suffered the brunt of the war, being subject to a long siege and near starvation. Parisians had fought for the new republic and paid dearly for it, and they were not about to watch it be taken away by a royalist coup. In March, these tensions reached a head when the new Republican government sitting temporarily in Versailles decided it would be wise to disarm Paris and prevent a possible conflict. When it was learned that Thiers was going to appropriate cannons stationed in the Parisian fort of Montmartre, Republicans rose up in defense of the Republic and declared the French capital an independent commune. Only 3 months after the end of hostilities with Prussia, France was now embroiled in a civil war, with Parisian radicals calling for a program of communal autonomy and a break with the state. Over the next 3 months, the Commune of Paris posed a formidable challenge to state rule in France. So-called communards overran the city, setting up their own political institutions. As the government in Versailles mounted a military campaign to suppress the radical uprising, communard leaders responded with a vicious reign of terror against all suspected monarchists and religious officials. These executions did nothing to elicit sympathy for the radical cause. In late May, government troops stormed the capital, crushing the communal government and leaving some 20,000 Parisians dead. Long a presence in French political life since the years of the Revolution, Jacobin radicalism was now dealt a crippling blow in the country. With the suppression of the Paris Commune, known radicals were either summarily executed or driven into exile. As the writer Edmond de Goncourt claimed, Thiers and the government were bleeding the country white, white being the traditional color of the Bourbon monarchy. The Franco-Prussian War and vicious civil war that spring irrevocably scarred the infant republic. These events bookended what the writer Victor Hugo called the Année Terrible, the unfortunate year marked by military defeat, bloody conflict, and the decline of French predominance across continental Europe. If it were to survive, the new republic would have to recover from these humiliating trials. Above all, this required rehabilitating the nation in the wake of defeat and reconciling the old political hatreds and divisions that perpetually haunted the country. As to whether a new generation of Republicans was in fact up to this daunting task had yet to be seen. For the moment, the question of whether the Republic would even survive in France remained acute. Monarchists in the National Assembly had a significant influence over the government, while Adolphe Thiers, a known Orleanist, appointed President of the Republic in 1871, was hardly an ardent Republican supporter. With a long political career behind him, Thiers was no stranger to the volatility and deep divisions that had roiled France for much of the 19th century. A monarchist in principle, he was also a dedicated liberal and French patriot. As the political storms of 1871 gathered, it was a moment of deep reflection and consideration for everybody, but above all, it was a critical moment for the aged liberal who had served his country since the 1830s. Contrary to initial suspicions, Thiers was not as sympathetic to the monarchist faction as people supposed. It was assumed that with a monarchist majority in the assembly, France would logically nominate a king to assume the throne. However, Thiers was not receptive to this idea. He recognized that conservatives and royalists were divided between placing a Bourbon, an Orleanist, or even another Bonaparte on the throne. Could the conservatives agree on a single candidate? Thiers did not think so. In his estimation, these disagreements made monarchy impractical. As Thiers pointedly put it, there was not enough room on the throne for 3 fat asses. To the surprise of his critics, Thiers began signaling that sustaining the Republican government might be the best option. It is the form of government that divides us least, he claimed. Although hardly a Republican sympathizer, Thiers could be pragmatic when it counted, and at this crucial juncture, pragmatism was essential. Yet if the Republic were to survive in France, it was going to be a conservative republic. Radical Jacobinism and a social republic were out of the question and stood no real chance of success. The challenge at hand, however, was how to win over the monarchists and conservatives to the idea of this conservative republic. In the early 1870s, the Duc de Chambord, the Bourbon candidate, made this task a bit easier. In discussion with his monarchist allies, Chambord had made it known that he would only accept the French throne if the white flag of the royal fleur-de-lis was made the national flag and the revolutionary tricolor abandoned. Monarchists detested the revolution and all it stood for, but even they were aware of its power and symbolism in French national life. To endorse such a symbolic affront to the revolution would mean a direct repudiation of the French Revolution and France's national heritage. Such a gesture would undoubtedly encourage yet another revolution in France, igniting a war between liberals, republicans, and conservatives. In short, raising the standard of the Bourbon dynasty and making it the national flag of the country was as unthinkable as it was dangerous. Believing that victory was in their grasp, royalists tried to work out a compromise, urging Chambord to make certain public concessions for the sake of the larger cause. Chambord stuck to his ultra-royalist convictions, however, flatly stating he would not serve under the revolutionary tricolor. Dismayed, in 1875, royalists were compelled to abandon his candidacy as a possible contender for the throne. Chambord returned to Austria, where he had been living in exile, and would die there childless in 1883, placing a permanent end to the direct Bourbon dynastic line in France. With Chambord's departure from the political stage, the monarchist cause was momentarily defeated. If the Commune and purges had dealt a blow to Republican radicalism in the country, French royalists were now equally put at bay. Two of the principal opposition groups to Thiers' idea of a conservative republic had been removed, giving Republicans hope that they would be able to finally secure a stable Republican government in the country, one that would rule in the name of the revolution without being revolutionary in spirit. Faced with the various challenges during the 1870s, liberals and Republicans found common ground in their desire for a government of order and national rehabilitation. Republican leaders like Léon Gambetta, Jules Simon, and Jules Ferry ran newspapers and engaged former political adversaries. Above all, they committed themselves to cooperating with other elites and hammering out agreements regarding the institutions and polity that would make up a new Republican regime in the country. They were also instrumental in giving public speeches and undertaking campaign tours, intending to sell the idea of a moderate Republican Party to French voters. Their efforts paid off. During the 1870s, Republicans continued to win seats in the National Assembly. This was accompanied by electoral gains at the local level as well, ushering in a so-called town hall revolution that saw Republican candidates assume positions as mayors and local representatives across the country. By the end of the decade, Republicans had at their disposal an entrenched local base of support and a solid nationwide political network capable of mobilizing support on the ground. In 1879, this grassroots politicking achieved one of the most significant victories: a genuinely Republican president in the guise of Jules Grévy, a stalwart Republican supporter and lawyer, active in Republican circles since the days of 1848. With a power base at both the local and national levels by 1880, Republicans had enough of a majority to begin transforming the Third Republic into a Republican Republic, rather than one that was merely tolerated by conservatives. To this end, Republicans carried out a slow and progressive purge of the administration, replacing officials and ministers with known pro-monarchist leanings with men whose Republican credentials were impeccable. Yet it was evident that the Republic could not survive merely through changes in administrative personnel. Republican values also had to be institutionalized and instilled in the general population, and this required a far more ambitious and energetic task. Moreover, despite the common sense of mission, French Republicans remained divided on a number of issues. These divisions could present a potential obstacle to a concerted initiative focused on republicanizing France. The key was to find issues that Republicans could agree on. To this end, a series of laws were passed in the early 1880s that intended to create consensus and outline a Republican program supported by political elites. For one, Republicans were united on the issue of anti-clericalism. Since the French Revolution, Republican ideology had harbored deep suspicions regarding religious authority and the church. While most Republicans did not subscribe to the radical anti-religious policies of men like Robespierre and Blanqui, they were committed to forming a secular or laïque society free of religious influences. Religion was a private affair. It had little place within the secular public life of a Republican society. This pronounced laicism was a hallmark of French Republican thinking, and education was seen as the essential vehicle for creating this envisaged Republic laïque. Since the 1830s, state and religious authorities had grappled over the issue of who would influence young minds in the country. Republicans were dead set on putting an end to this heated struggle. In 1881, the acting Minister of Education, Jules Ferry, enacted laws to see through education reform in line with Republican values. The Ferry laws abolished tuition fees for elementary education, ensuring that all children would have access to public state schools. At the same time, school attendance, whether state or religious, was made compulsory for children. These measures were designed to make state schools competitive with religious schools and draw in children from across the country. A standard curriculum was agreed upon, ensuring conformity in national education and creating a standard, centralized education system. In this way, educators were made responsible for disseminating Republican values and knowledge to French children and encouraging attachment to a Republican French state and society. It was also evident that Republicanizing initiatives were also nationalizing initiatives. By the mid-19th century, nearly a quarter of France did not speak Parisian French. Patois and regional dialects were used in peasant communities, while Flemish and German were spoken in the eastern part of the country. This linguistic diversity posed not only an obstacle to delivering a standard education, it posed a threat to national unity, Republicans believed. Republican education responded by enforcing a national education in standard French. Children were compelled to abandon their regional dialects and use a standardized language. If one wanted to obtain a civil service job, they were required to speak, read, and write in the national language of the state, ensuring that upward mobility was dependent upon learning this proper French. Through these language policies, the Republican government came to root itself more firmly in the rural countryside, and Parisian French slowly overtook the array of regional patois previously spoken throughout the country. It was evident that the Ferry laws intended to use education to forge a national identity and encourage patriotism. Under the standardized education system, children were instructed in history and geography lessons, all of which were intended to familiarize them with their country's past and make them think of themselves as a unified people with a common history, culture, and common set of political institutions rooted in the Republic. These reforms encouraging patriotism and literacy also served to politicize the peasantry, continuing trends taking place since the 1840s. Peasants once concerned with local and regional affairs were beginning to see themselves as members of a wider French nation-state. Cheap newspapers printed in French began to crop up in the provinces, informing peasants on political and cultural trends. Countrymen were encouraged to participate in local government, where they would learn what was required of them as citizens of a democratic republic. The introduction of a modern political culture was aimed at forging a new Republican citizen possessing at least a rudimentary education, one who was civic-minded and possessed a sense of patriotism and attachment to the Republic. In 1884, further legislation was passed in line with Republican objectives. That year, the politician Pierre Waldeck-Rousseau initiated a law guaranteeing freedom of assembly in the press. Under the law, labor unions were declared legal, giving the French working class the right to bargain with their employers and strike if necessary. This legislation set out to ease social relations between workers and their employers and discourage the types of radical proletarian uprisings that had destabilized France in the past. It also served to draw workers to the Republican government in the hopes that they would not revolt against the state. cultivating a sense of patriotism and nationalism in French citizens, Republicans were also concerned with the status of France as a great power. The war indemnity imposed by Prussia had surprisingly been paid off quickly. Bismarck had intended to cripple France economically, but Adolphe Thiers had managed the payments with skill. He had kept the franc low to stimulate trade and the economy. To raise additional revenue, he had issued short-term government-backed bonds that were purchased by the French people. Through these financial strategies, the indemnity was paid off within 3 years, ending the German occupation of French territory. Yet even if the immediate repercussions of the war were eased, bitter memories lingered. Republicans persisted to harbor a revanchist agenda aimed at reacquiring the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. National revival became a veritable mantra for Republican politicians in the 1870s and 1880s, as France sought to restore itself as a great European power following the Franco-Prussian War. This too became part of the dominant Republican outlook, feeding a new sense of nationalism that was both pro-Republican and anti-German. As the 1880s progressed, Republicans began to express greater confidence in both the resiliency of their institutions and the security of the government they had created. The Third Republic had weathered the storms of radical and monarchist resistance, enshrining the Republic at the heart of French national life. This was no insignificant achievement in a country racked by a century of political instability and social unrest. Yet the question of whether the Republic would endure, whether its program of national reconciliation and unity would ultimately succeed, was never far from the minds of Republican elites. In a country like France, was anything perpetual? The Third Republic would attempt to put this question to the test.